ch.58 on the martial Deity Avenue, an awe-inspiring first impression. The sword thrust, penetrating the heart of the ghost, and killed it dead on the ground. By heaven's blessings, ghosts are slayed and evil is subdued. On either side of the martial Deity Avenue, cheers erupted like an ocean current, coming in waves after waves, each one higher than the other. Before the crimson-red gates of the palace, in the courtyard, the two cultivators who played the roles of god and ghost bowed to the surrounding crowds and stepped down, standing off to the side. The martial match that opened the act heightened the excitement in the city, not only with the streets elbow to elbow crowded, even the roofs were littered with brave climbers. Clapping, hollering, the crowds were going wild. A celebration of this magnitude was truly brimming and bustling in the history of the kingdom of Xianlei. If any festival of Shangyuan one was to be described thus, it must be the one happening today. Upon the towering platform, a row of finely dressed royals and nobles, all wearing courteous smiles on their faces, looked over below to the crowd. Within the palace, a long line of hundreds waited silently. When the bell chimed, Guoshi smoothed his non-existent moustache and called path-opening warriors. Present. Crown Prince's Celestial Fairies. Present. Musicians. Present. Cavalry. Present. Ghost. Present. The God-pleasing martial warrior. No one answered. Guoshi frowned, noticing a complication, and turned his head. The God-pleasing martial warrior. Where's the crown prince? Still, no one responded. The one who answered to Ghost earlier hesitated, then removed the horrifying mask, revealing a clean, pale face. This young man appeared to be about 16 or 17. His skin and lips were both light in color. Fresh and neat, with a pair of eyes black like obsidian, shining bright. His hair was soft and silky, a few loose strands lightly littered on his forehead and cheeks. He looked quiet and obedient, contrasting with the monstrous mask in his hand. He replied quietly, "His Highness the Crown Prince has left." Guoshi almost fainted. But, for the sake of this grand occasion he couldn't faint, so he held on, and shouted with angry exasperation, "Wah!" Exclamation mark. He left. Exclamation mark. When did His Highness leave? The ceremonial parade is about to leave the palace gates. Exclamation mark. When the grand stage is revealed and there's only a ghost but no god, my old bones won't be able to swim out of all the spit that'll come flying at me. Mew King, why didn't you stop him? Mew King lowered his head. When His Highness left he told me to pass on the message, saying not to worry, and everything can go as planned. He will return promptly. Guoshi was hysterical. How can I not worry? What do you mean, promptly? When is promptly? What if he doesn't make it? Outside the palace gates, some of the people who had been waiting since early morning were losing patience and were noisily demanding for the event to start. A cultivator came rushing forward. My Lord Guoshi, the Queen sent a messenger asking why the parade hasn't started. The fortuitous hour, too, is fast approaching. If we don't leave now, we'll miss it. Hearing this, Guoshi prayed that a rebel army would suddenly invade and disrupt the Shangyuan parade completely. That this headache would happen right at the most crucial moment. If this headache was anyone else, he would have roared with rage already, even raising his sword to kill. Wouldn't be strange. But this headache just so happened to be his pride and joy, and the very, very, very distinguished, precious son of another. He couldn't beat him, he couldn't yell at him, and he definitely couldn't kill him. Rather than kill him, he'd more likely kill himself. Just then, someone ran across the Black Palace path, rushing into the palace, shouting, "Lord Guoxi, why hasn't the parade started? The time is about to pass, everyone outside is on edge." The one who came was also a young man of 16 or 17, his form upright and tall, his skin the color of wheat, his back carried a long black bow and a snow-white quiver. His lips were pressed tight, his brows knit. Even at such a young age his eyes were strong and determined. The moment Guoxi saw him, he grabbed him. "Feng Xin. Where's His Highness?" Feng Xin was taken aback, but instantly appeared to have understood something, and anger filled his eyes, turning his gaze to Mu King. As for Mu King, he had already put his ghost mask back on without a word, his expression unseen. Feng Xin said gravely, "There's no time to explain. Please start the parade immediately, His Highness the Crown Prince will not disappoint you." There was no escape. Bringing out a grand stage without the God-pleasing martial warrior was death. Delaying the procession and missing the fortuitous hour was also death. Despairingly, Guoxi waved his hand. "Start the music, depart." Upon receiving the command, the flutes and strings started to play, and the hundreds of royal warriors at the front of the procession cried, beginning their march, leading the massive, impressive parade. They had departed. The warriors at the front symbolized the thorny paths of the mortal world. Immediately following were the virgin girls specially chosen, beautiful and elegant, a basket in their hands, tossing flowers in the air like fairies, paving the path with blossoms and filling it with fragrance. The musicians rode in carriages of gold. The moment the procession left the palace gates, the crowds were amazed and astonished, fighting to catch the flowers. However, no matter how glamorous, how grand, this was only the warm-up act. The grand float, a glorious stage, was about to emerge. 16 white stallions decked in gold pulled the grand stage from the depths of the palace gates, slowly coming into sight before the eyes of millions. On the stage was a black-clad ghost, a monstrous mask on his face, a 9-foot-long saber in his hand before him. Bravely, he shifted to a fighting stance. Guoxi's heart was tense, waiting for a miracle. Yet, no miracles happened. The crowd broke into chatter. Above on the high platform, the royals and nobles frowned, looking at each other, all wondering, "What's going on? Why is the God-pleasing martial warrior not on stage? Has His Highness the Crown Prince not arrived yet? Where's Lian Gege?" At the center of the tall platform sat a dignified, handsome man, and a pale-skinned, amiable, and gracious noblewoman. They were the king and queen of the kingdom of Xianlei. Not seeing the one who should be there, the queen appeared worried and gave the king a look. The king took hold of her hand, using his gaze to comfort, telling her not to worry, and to watch and see what would happen. The crowds below, however, had no one to comfort them, and yelled crazedly, the shouting so loud it could almost raise roofs. The Guoxi could only hate himself for not having the courage to kill himself right there and then. Yet Mew King, who was on stage, was quite calm. Even without his opponent he looked at ease, taking care of his own mission, and clang, threw his heavy saber down, resting it upright before him. Performing a round of chilling slaughter, the black-clad youth impressively ended the opening act of becoming a ghost. By face and by form, Mew King was delicate and elegant like a gentle scholar, but an impossibly heavy 9-foot-long saber was still swung like it was feather-light in his hands, as if it was weightless. Another group of cultivators playing ghosts leapt onto the stage. They were instantly defeated, and chased off the stage. The sword danced skillfully, calm and collected, and made the performance quite exciting to watch. So some in the crowds cheered for him. However, the people didn't come to watch ghosts causing havoc, so after that act there were more noise demanding, "Where's the God-pleasing martial warrior? Where's His Highness the Crown Prince? We want to see His Highness playing the great martial emperor. Defeat evil." Upon the towering platform, a furious voice shouted, "Where's my cousin? What the hell?" Exclamation mark. Who wants to watch this bullshit? Where the fuck is my cousin the Crown Prince? No need to see who it was. Obviously that loud voice belonged to none other than Qi Rong, the Prince Co. Jing. Sure enough, many looked up and saw a young man finely dressed in a light turquoise brocade and a necklace rush to the edge of that platform, raising his fists angrily. This young man was no more than 15 or 16, his face pale and his brows black, rather good-looking, but his face was twisted, as if he would jump off the tower at any time to punch someone. However, the tower was too tall, so if he jumped, he'd break his legs, if not die. So instead, he grabbed a white jade teapot and threw it. That thrown teapot was aimed directly at the back of the head of the ghost, flying at him speedily, looking like it might knock him out on the spot. Surprisingly, the ghost shifted his body, raised the long saber slightly, and caught the teapot on his blade. The quivering teapot came to a stop at the tip of the blade, prompting another wave of cheers. Mew King then flicked the long saber and the teapot was hurled into the air, later caught by someone below the stage. He continued to play the role of the ghost languidly, swinging the long saber, slaughtering humans. Qi Rong was enraged and was going to throw something else, but the queen had ordered someone to drag him down, and so he was dragged down reluctantly. Yet the faces of the nobles were looking more and more grim, some becoming restless. That the God-pleasing martial warrior would disappear right before the heavenly procession of the Changyuan festival was no laughing matter. Just then, a roaring cheer like a storm exploded from amongst the people, louder than the cheers from before. A snow-white silhouette had descended from the sky, and landed right before the black-clad ghost. Upon his landing, his heavy white dress fluttered and covered the grand stage in the shape of a giant flower, a golden mask hiding his face. He held a sword in one hand, the other gently flicked the foreboding sword, the resounding ringing pleasing to the ear. This gesture was serene and confident, as if the ghost meant nothing to him. The ghost slowly raised his long saber and pointed it at him, and the white-clad martial warrior unhurriedly rose to his feet. Qi Rong's eyes were shining brightly, his face red. He jumped up and down, shouting, "Cousin Crown Prince! Cousin Crown Prince has come!" Exclamation mark. Exclamation mark. Above and below, all were stunned to silence. This entrance was like a real descent of a heavenly being, exceedingly audacious. That fortress tower was at least over 10 meters tall, and as the eminent crown prince whose person was worth 1,000 gold, he still jumped down from it. In that moment, thousands had thought a god had truly descended. When they recovered from their shock, fervor filled their veins, the crowd went hysterical, applauding with intensity. Chi Rong too was shouting, leading the crowd in mad applause. Shouting until his voice was hoarse, clapping until both his hands were red. The king and the queen shared a look, smiling, and applauded too. The rest of the nobles eased their brows and sighed a breath of relief before joining in the cheer. On either side of the martial Deity Avenue, crowds were going wild like crashing waves, hundreds and thousands of men so excited they pushed against the royal guards, wanting to approach closer and holler. Upon the grand stage, two forms, one black, one white, faced each other. Each with their own weapon in hand, god and ghost would finally face off. Seeing that everything worked out, Guoshi finally relaxed his shoulders and mounted the towering platform. After nodding to his fellows in greeting, he found a seat for himself and sat down. The king chuckled, "Guoshi, how did you come up with such an exhilarating entrance?" "How exciting!" Guoshi wiped sweat from his face and smiled. "It's indeed exciting. But unfortunately, this lowly servant didn't come up with it. I'm afraid it's His Highness the Crown Prince's own idea." The queen patted her heart. That mischievous child. To jump from such a height without a word of warning. I almost stood up in fright. Guoshi couldn't help but lace his words with pride. My lady queen can be at ease. The martial might of His Highness the Crown Prince is extraordinary. Tens of meters is nothing to him, and even with towers that are many times higher, he can easily mount and easily jump with his eyes closed. The queen appeared pleased and said gently, "Thanks to the teachings of Guoshi." Guoshi laughed. It's nothing. His Highness the Crown Prince, darling of the heavens, is divinely gifted, marvelously talented, and graciously brilliant. It is the fortune collected for 3 lifetimes that gave this lowly servant the chance to become his teacher. I have a premonition that with His Highness the Crown Prince's presence, today will go down in history as the most impressive martial match of the God-pleasing ceremony. His words of praise were smooth and eluded the heavens. The king smiled and turned his head back to watch the performance. I hope that's the case. In the heavenly procession of the Shangyuan festival, the God-pleasing martial warrior and the ghost were the two most important roles. Both must be young men exceedingly skilled in martial arts. Especially the God-pleasing martial warrior, the presentation and make of his costume were strict, transcendently glamorous. After dressing, the weight of everything worn came to be about 40 to 50 pounds. The martial warrior must, under this heavy burden, before the eyes of millions, march around the capital many times, and perform in the martial match for at least 4 hours. There must be no mistakes made throughout, and the performer must be extraordinarily skilled. Fortunately, both young men were exceedingly talented. The saber parried with the sword, one slashed, another struck. The thrilling match was a sight to behold. The moves were also calculated to the minutest detail, obviously having been practiced and rehearsed a number of times. Who's the one playing the ghost and parrying with the crown prince? The king asked. Guoshi cleared his throat. Your Majesty, he's a young trainee from the Royal Holy Pavilion. His name is Mu King. The Queen said gently, I see that child is also rather skilled in fighting, just a bit weaker than my son. Maybe about the same level as Feng Xin.
Guoshi didn't appear to agree with her sentiment.
Qi Rong had been laying on the lap of the Queen, munching on grapes, and spat out the skins in a rush. Passage, PSH, PSH. No way, no way.
Not just a bit weaker, he's far weaker.
Not just anyone can compare to cousin Crown Prince.
Hearing this, the Queen patted his head, smiling, and the rest of the nobles all laughed, their bodies
swaying back and forth in mirth. They teased, Little Wrong certainly clings to his cousin. If he doesn't
praise him for a day, he's miserable.
Down below in the crowd, the cheers and hollers were rising to the heavens. Fight! Fight!
Kill him!
Slay the evil! The roars of excitement were growing stronger. Qi Rong was also adding to the noise, both his hands around his mouth like a trumpet, shouting and laughing. Cousin Crown Prince, go! You can easily knock him down with one hand, show him.
Pal, it's done.
Suddenly, the ghost on the stage slashed forward.
The martial warrior repelled the attack with his sword. But,
Ed. Technically, during the heavenly parade, the martial match was a performance for pleasing the gods, and at most one should only use a seventh of their power, ceasing after sword's touch.
However, with the strike
he received just now, the sword in his hand almost flew out. Obviously his opponent had used all of his might in that blow.
Xi Lian raised his head slightly and called out, Mu King.
The young man playing the ghost didn't say a word, and slashed at him again.
Xi Lian had no time to
think, and received one attack after the other, their weapons clanging. Well, this is more exciting than fake play, Xi Lian thought, and his spirit heightened, getting more into the fight. Thus, under the crashing roar of cheers, the weapons clashed and sparks flew.
The more invigorating the
fight was on stage, the louder the cheers below. Suddenly, there was a deafening swing, white light flashed, and the crowd had their breaths held. That 9-foot-long saber of the ghost was snapped out of his hand by the long slender sword of the god-pleasing martial warrior, and it flew toward a stone
pillar of the towering platform, and became embedded into it.
A few bystanders tried to pull it out, but
even when they pulled with all their strength, the long saber didn't move an inch.
What kind of saber is this?
What strength you must need. Upon the grand stage, the god-pleasing martial warrior shook his sword, and flicked his finger on the
blade again. Another tinkling sound, and behind the golden mask came soft chuckling. You fought well, but you still lost, Xi Lian said, calmly but cheerfully. The ghost had lost his weapon, and half kneeled on the ground, still silent, but his fist gripped tighter. Xi Lian craftily spun his sword, and under the cheers from all around, was about to launch his final strike, slaying the ghost, when just then, there was screaming from above.
Shocked, Xi Lian lowered his sword and looked up, and saw a blurry shadow falling rapidly from the city
wall. In that moment, he didn't have time to think, and in a flash, he tipped his feet and pushed off the ground,
leaping into the air, darting upwards weightlessly. He surged and flew, his sleeves fluttering open like the wings of a butterfly, then landed gracefully, light
like a feather. Tightly in his hold was a person, and only when he touched solid ground did Xi Lian sigh. breath of relief and looked down. In his arms was a child, head wrapped full of bandages, dirty and unkempt, curled in his hold and watching him dazedly. One recap: Changyuan Festival is also known as the Lantern Festival, marking the 15th and last day of the Lunar New Year. It's a day for worshipping and celebrating the celestial heavens. On a separate note, Jungyuan celebrates the dead, and Shayuan celebrates the waters.
Yuan means
the origins of the universe in Chinese foundation philosophy I Ching, and the Yuan festivals divided the lunar year into three, the upper Chang, the middle Zhong, and the lower Qia, each celebrating the
divine forces that invigorate the world. 2. Fortuitous hour, the best time to perform certain actions, based on the daily fortune calendar that
stipulates how lucky each hour is based on the date, month, year, and the stars. Next chapter. Ch.59 on the martial Deity Avenue, an awe-inspiring first impression 2.
This child was no older than 7 or 8, and quite the gaunt and small creature.
Falling from such a height, his little body was shaking uncontrollably in his arms like a newborn animal. However, from that
mess of bandages wrapped around his head peeked a large eye, black in color, reflecting the silhouette of a snow-white figure within, watching him unblinkingly as if he could no longer see anything else.
Loud gasps were heard from all around, and when Si Lian raised his head, his heart sank. In his peripheral vision, he saw lying on the ground not far away a golden object. The golden mask that hid his face had fallen.
Si Lian had landed in the middle of the martial Deity Avenue, and the ceremonial parade was miles behind him, the procession not having made it that far yet.
The sudden commotion broke the steady
march of the warriors. The flower-tossing celestial fairies looked panicked, the golden carriages stopped, a
number of white stallions stomped their hooves and neighed in alarm, and the strings missed notes and their rhythms disrupted. Some kept going, and some stopped,
without being able to coordinate their
march again. The entire situation was going out of control. The crowd on both sides of the street still
hadn't had the chance to react, but the king of Xianlei upon the towering platform stood up immediately.
Watching his son's silhouette, his expression worried and grave. The moment he stood, how could the rest of the nobles remain seated? Thus they all rose to their feet in a frenzy. Guoxi's bottom had only just warmed his seat, but now it was cold again. He was rapidly thinking whether he needed to prostrate on all fours immediately to beg for forgiveness, and Shirong had already leapt onto the railing, his sleeves rolled up, shouting in rage. What's going on now? What's happening? Why did the procession fall into chaos?
What the hell are you useless trash doing?
Did you all eat nothing but plain rice? So dumb you can't even hold your horses.
The queen's face was pale, her brows slightly knitted, and hurriedly sent for another to drag him back.
The crowds were growing agitated and a riot was about to erupt when just then, Si Lian rose to his feet. Usually, the honorable crown prince was hidden deep within the palace or training at the royal holy pavilion, and rarely had the chance to show his face to the people. This was such a rare occasion that many couldn't help but be intrigued, the gazers all falling on him. Seeing his face, they all held their breath. That young man had long brows and charming eyes, dignified and handsome, radiating nobility.
His aura blindingly bright, forcing down the eyes of those looking.
With the child in one arm, he raised the other with the sword in hand, and pointed it to the grand stage. That ghost had been observing the situation from above the stage, and seeing that gesture, he paused for a moment before leaping off the ground.
The crowd wowed in amazement as the ghost, his form like a streak of black cloud, flew through the air to
the stone pillar where the saber was deeply embedded.
He pulled it out from the crack, then flipped
again, landing in the middle of the street before the martial warrior. Seeing that he instantaneously understood his intentions and came forth to cooperate, Si Lian lauded under his breath, "Good, Mu King." Now both the God-pleasing martial warrior and the ghost had descended from the stage. One black, one white saber and sword clashed once again, heightening the excitement, electrifying the crowd. Upon the towering platform, the faces of nobles finally relaxed, looking appeased. The ghost feigned the act to aim for the child in the warrior's arms, with both his hands holding the saber. Gripping it to his side, he rushed towards Si Lian.
The two faked parrying, moves after moves, strike
after strike, then they leapt back onto the stage anew.
While the crowd was distracted, Mu King used the
chance to do a somersault onto the street, grabbed the mask, then dashed through the procession, urging
in a low voice,
"Don't scramble. Compose yourselves.
Pretend nothing's happened and continue the march.
Finish marching this round and return to the palace."
All within the procession immediately steadied and returned to their posts, their spirits renewed. The
moment Mu King returned to the stage, his attacks became even more vigorous, clinking and clanking. Si Lian receiving more slashes. Just then, the child in his arms cried out, probably terrified by being
stuck between the clashing weapons.
Si Lian's left hand held him tighter and he whispered, "Don't be scared."
Hearing his words, the small child gripped on to the folds of his robes at his chest.
Even with a child in one arm and the other hand handling a sword, Si Lian was still fighting with ease. Parrying for a while. He felt the child in his hold raise his trembling arms and grab hold of his shoulders in a deadly grip, as if he were hanging on for dear life. Si Lian soothed again, "Don't worry, nothing will hurt you." After speaking those words, Si Lian called in a low voice, "Mu King." The ghost facing him inconspicuously inclined his head, and Si Lian struck. Thus, before the eyes of millions, the God-pleasing martial warrior pierced the heart of the ghost, slaying it on the spot. Mu King, with his ghost mask on, clutched his wound, stumbled back a few steps, struggled for a moment before finally, thud, he fell to the ground, and stopped moving. Above, on the platform, Qirong laughed out loud, applauding.
"Dead.
He's dead.
Cousin Crown Prince has slain the ghost dead."
While all this was happening, the magnificent heavenly procession had continued to march, and soon moved onto the path back to the palace. Because of how well the act was saved and how the unexpected improvised act was exhilarating to watch, not only did the people not complain, but rather their excitement grew even stronger.
Countless within the crowd were shouting, "Your Highness," hollering, "God," and followed behind the grand stage, thousands upon millions rushing to the palace.
A few of the generals had to send out many more troops of warriors and soldiers to block the overly excited people.
However, in the end they still couldn't hold them back, and the crowd broke through, pushing themselves
towards the palace gates. The king of Xianlei called from the top of the towering platform, "Guards! Warriors!" At the same time, the hundreds within the procession all had re-entered the palace, and the giant crimson Gates closed soundly shut after the grand stage, the colorful banners of the performance now out of sight. The people rushed the gates, knocking and slapping upon it, their cheers ringing to the heavens.
Inside the tightly closed palace gates, upon the grand stage, the white-clad God-pleasing martial warrior
and the black-clad ghost both threw their weapons onto the ground with two clanking sounds, before collapsing heavily on the ground. Lian was covered in sweat and ripped open layers and layers of his elegant costume before exhaling deeply. That was close. Too close.
I'm exhausted. Mew King also removed his heavy ghost mask, and let out a long breath silently, but didn't complain about
being tired.
When he looked over, he saw Lian was still holding on to that young child and frowned wordlessly. Feng Xin, on the other hand, called out as he followed after the grand stage in a jog.
Your Highness, what are you doing, bringing the child in too? That young child was lying on Lian's chest, his small body frozen and unmoving, afraid to even breathe loudly.
Lian sat up.
What was I to do, throw him back out on the streets? It's a mess out there, he's such a tiny creature.
He'd get trampled to death. He held up the small child and patted his head, asking casually, how old are you, little guy?
That child didn't blink, and his lips uttered no sounds. Lian continued his query, his tone soothing. How did you come to fall earlier? Your Highness, the child probably doesn't dare to speak, he's obviously scared witless, Mew King said.
Lian patted the head of that young child again, but his unresponsiveness made him lose interest, so he
stopped patting. So silly, Lian commented. Feng Xin, go find someone to take him out through the side doors when you get a chance, see if he's injured, his head is wrapped in bandages. All right, Feng Xin extended his hand. Give him here. Lian held the young child up and passed him over, but before he could do so, Feng Xin said, Your Highness, why haven't you let go?
I did let go.
Lian was puzzled, but when he looked down, he laughed exasperatedly. Turns out it was the child, who was still gripping tightly onto his clothes, refusing to let go. A few were taken aback and started laughing out loud. While training at the Royal Holy Pavilion, so many devotees, men and women alike, tried their hardest to get a glimpse of Lian, whether it be out of curiosity or devotion. But when they'd seen him once, they'd want to see him again, if they could train next to him, then even better.
They couldn't believe that a child at such a young age would also be the same.
Guarding the grand stage were many young trainees from the Royal Holy Pavilion, and they all snickered. Your Highness, this child doesn't want to leave. Lian also laughed. Is that right?
That won't do.
I've got my own things to do. Go home, little kid. Hearing this, that child finally loosened his grip slowly, letting go of his clothes, and Feng Xin picked him up. Even when the person holding him was now Feng Xin, the child was still staring at Lian with his large, dark eye, looking as if he was possessed. Many who were witnessing this started muttering silently, noting that intense stare. Lian himself, however, wasn't even looking at the child anymore, and only spoke to Feng Xin directly.
Don't pick him up like you're picking up trash. You're scaring him.
Feng Xin put the child back down on the ground.
Enough joking around. Guoshi is freaking out.
Your
Highness better think about how you're going to face him later.
Hearing this, everyone stopped laughing. An hour later, at the Royal Holy Pavilion, on the martial deity summit, inside the great martial hall, clouds of incense wafted in the air, and the sound of chanting came in waves. Guoshi and 3 other deputy Guoshi sat in a line by the side wall within the great hall, their faces clouded. Mu King was kneeling before them. Si Lian was also kneeling, but before him was nothing but the golden statue of the martial heavenly emperor. Feng Xin followed his master and knelt behind him. Guoshi picked up that exquisitely crafted golden mask, and after a moment he heaved a heavy sigh. Your Highness, Your Highness. Even when kneeling, Si Lian's back was straight, his posture perfect and his head raised.
Present.
Guoshi looked pained.
Do you know that, in the history of Xianlei, having held so many Shangyuan
heavenly ceremonial processions, never once did the grand stage only circle the capital thrice. Thrice. Every ritual of the Shangyuan heavenly ceremonial procession, every decoration in every place, had a meaning behind it.
To have the grand stage circle the capital once symbolized the kingdom's prayer for
the peace and happiness of the people for 1 year. Thus, however many rounds the grand stage made,
meant however many years another such grand ceremony need not take place.
Not only did this signify good fortune, it also saved money. Having only made 3 rounds, didn't that mean the kingdom would only be protected for 3 years? The worst thing on top of that was the golden mask on the face of the God-pleasing martial warrior had fallen mid-ritual. Since ancient times, the people of Xianlei had believed that the spiritual aura of a person resided upon the 5 facial features. The spirit of a person was on their face, and the best must be offered to the heavens.
Thus, in the midst of a ceremony, the martial warrior must wear a golden mask to hide their features,
because his face could only be appreciated by the gods, and mortals have no right to see it. Guoshi was both furious and disappointed. The God-pleasing martial warriors of the past circled the capital at minimum 5 times, at most 15 or 16 times.
You can do 50 with your eyes
closed. 100 even. But you killed yourself dead at 3, why didn't you just kill me, your master?
first? Now look at you.
Our dear Highness the Crown Prince is going to go down in history, dragging me along with you. No one dared speak in the great hall. Yet, Si Lian still looked to be at ease, and calmly responded.
Guoshi, why don't you look at it this way?
If that child had fallen to his death with no one to catch him, spilling blood on the path of the procession, wouldn't that be equally ominous?
Wouldn't the parade still
have to come to a stop? At the very least, the ceremony ended decently, and it was the best-case scenario. Let's just call what happened an accident. For a moment, Guoshi's words were stuck in his throat, but then he blew up. You child. With so many royal guards on site, anyone could have caught him. Even if the catch is off and he breaks an arm, he wouldn't die. You could have just marched forward a few steps, performed a little flashier, and everyone
would forget whatever had fallen and move on.
Si Lian raised his brows. Guoshi, you understand as well as I.
Under those circumstances, no one else but me could have reacted as fast, and there was no second person who could have caught him without injuries.
Let him fall, there'd be 1 dead. Catch him, and there'd be 2 dead. His words were confident and self-assured. The Guoshis also knew that what he had said was true, and couldn't refute.
But, seeing him kneel before the statue of God, looking like all was well and nothing was the matter, Guoshi was all angry, all amused, and all proud.
Before his precious, darling disciple, he just couldn't get angry, and could only pull at his own hair, and use the pain of his scalp to relieve the worry in
his heart.
After a pause, Guoshi spoke again. Another thing.
Si Lian inclined his head.
This disciple is listening.
You did well today on stage, Guoshi said.
But, no matter how well you performed, you can't just
suddenly change things up right before the start without a word of warning. Both majesties were terrified by your act today.
Do you know what would happen if we miss the fortuitous hour?
Si Lian knitted his long brows, looking puzzled.
Guoshi, in regard to this, hadn't I already asked for your permission before today? Guoshi was taken aback too. You'd asked already? Before today? When? Bewildered, Si Lian turned his head and looked, calling out, Mu King.
Next chapter.
Ch.60, Lost Red Pearl, Inadvertent Eyes Red with Desire.
Just then, Feng Xin, who was kneeling behind Si Lian, spoke up grimly.
His Highness did indeed mention it a couple days ago. All eyes went to him. Feng Xin continued, recently, His Highness has been putting a lot of thought into the heavenly procession, and yesterday he suddenly came up with the extraordinary idea of jumping off the tower to simulate celestial descent without changing anything else in the programming. At the time, His Highness was in the middle of rehearsals and couldn't get away, so he sent Mu King to pass on word
to Guoshi to request for the go-ahead.
He raised his head, anger obvious in his eyes. Mu King returned and told His Highness that Guoshi had been informed, so His Highness performed today under the impression that he got permission. Who knew? Guoshi had not known, and almost ruined the event.
The cultivators all looked at each other. Guoshi asked, who knew of this? The other three deputy Guoshi shook their heads, all denying knowing anything.
Guoshi turned to Mu King, his cloudy expression turning into one of anger. Mu King, you intentionally withheld communication. His words and expression showed he already firmly believed Mu King to be sabotaging the affair.
Purposely.
Si Lian glanced at the silent, expressionless youth kneeling on the side and pondered before
speaking up.
Guoshi, I think there must be some kind of misunderstanding here. Hearing this, Mu King shifted his eyes to stare at him, his gaze going dark. Si Lian said, if he had purposely held back word, once the event was over and we compared notes, his deceit would be revealed, and there'd be no way he could escape taking responsibility. Mu King is not a short-sighted imbecile, and he wouldn't have come up with such a low tactic. Besides, with the God-pleasing martial warrior missing, what advantage does the ghost opponent have? Please hear him out, Guoshi, and then draw a conclusion. Finishing his speech, Si Lian inclined his head. Tell us, Mu King. What happened? Mu King lowered his eyes and said softly, I did pass word on what His Highness bade me to say. Yesterday. Guoshi frowned. Won't we know ourselves what you did or did not say?
When did you tell us?
Yesterday, an hour after the evening lesson, when the four masters were resting at the Xixiang pavilion. This disciple spoke from outside the window, Mu King said. Guoshi turned his head to his three fellows, looking puzzled.
Yesterday, after the evening lessons.
What were we doing then? The moment the question left his lips, he remembered, and his face turned slightly blue from awkwardness. The other three deputy Guoshi also coughed nervously, their responses ambiguous.
Not really anything.
Just resting is resting.
Seeing how the Guoshi stammered, everyone understood immediately.
The Royal Holy Pavilion was a place of quiet meditation and training, and there was very little entertainment, only some small games that could be counted as amusement. One of them, the most
popular one, was playing cards.
Cards could only be played secretly, to be seen by no one. The Guoshi had long been bored out of their minds residing at the Royal Holy Pavilion, and so they were heavily addicted. When they started playing, they would forget everything and everyone, falling into a state akin to obsession or drunkenness.
Uncontrollably emotional, and definitely not able to hear anything from the outside.
If Mu King had said anything at that time, what could they possibly hear? One of the deputy Guoshi said, "Oh, maybe there were too many people, your voice was too low, and we didn't hear. Or, we didn't hear clearly."
Guoshi demanded suspiciously, "Did you actually go to the Xixiang Pavilion yesterday?"
"I absolutely did," Mu King said, and as proof, he relayed the dress, look, and accent of the guard standing at the gate without fault. Guoshi had to believe him, but still he frowned. If you had gone to the Xixiang Pavilion, you could have just
passed on the message to the trainee outside the door, or enter the chamber and communicate in detail.
Why speak outside by the window? You didn't even confirm whether we heard. Mu King responded softly, "It's not like I didn't try." This disciple had begged the Shishung
3 guarding the
door, but for some reason that Shishung had to make things difficult, and wouldn't let me into the chamber or pass on word for me. His words were taunting, and he booted me out.
After a pause, he continued, "This disciple had no other choice, so I went around to the other side of the
Xixiang Pavilion and tried to pass on the message through the window.
After I spoke, I heard one of the
Guoshi say, 'I understand, now leave,' so this disciple had taken that as consent to His Highness' plans, and returned. The Guoshi pursed their lips and didn't speak. At the height of a round of card games, who would pay attention to whatever was said outside? If they should hear anything, of course they'd respond offhandedly with, 'I understand,' but in reality, they probably didn't even know where the voice came from.
Si Lian knitted his brows. That such a thing would happen.
Which trainee is this impudent to be so
disrespectful to one of my messengers? He's got guts.
Although Si Lian was usually kind and gentle when interacting with others at the Royal Holy Pavilion, and never really put on airs, he was still nonetheless the esteemed son of the king, the prominent crown prince, and even as he knelt before the statue of God, he had not shown any meekness or timidity. In that moment of sternness, he was strong and authoritative without fury.
Everyone stayed quiet, and the Guoshi
wore unreadable expressions on their faces.
Why didn't you report this to me when you returned yesterday?
Si Lian asked. Mu King turned around while still kneeling, and prostrated, his voice quiet.
Your Highness, there's no
need to look further into this matter with that Shishung. I didn't say anything after returning yesterday.
Simply because I don't want to make this into a big deal.
And seriously, it's nothing major. If your Highness was to defend me openly, then it'll hurt the friendliness between everyone.
Si Lian disagreed, sounding upset. What is this friendliness with everyone? The kind of friendliness you
use to abuse others. Hearing this, the Guoshi sitting on the side looked even more agitated. At the end of the day, something like this happened because the Guoshi disliked Mu King. Since they were displeased, then the trainee attendants naturally followed their lead, and truly, Mu King himself wasn't that likable.
So, it was often that not only did fellow trainees inconvenience him, they'd
also make things difficult for him at every turn. Of course, this high and mighty disciple wasn't trying to be sarcastic, but he certainly did make a jab.
Through his words, it was obvious Mu King was backing off, but Feng Xin couldn't listen to another word.
And suddenly interjected. It really was nothing major, but you had to go and make it complicated. If you had told the trainee at the door that you went to deliver a message by His Royal Highness' command, would he still be brave enough to block your way?
Also, right before we departed today, Guoshi asked you where His Highness went. Why
did you answer so vaguely? Couldn't you have said clearly that His Highness was on top of the tower, waiting for the procession to start?
Mu King immediately argued back, calmly and steadily. I thought Guoshi already knew and didn't expect to be asked that question, so I was confused. But right after, I told Guoshi His Highness had already said
not to worry, and that the procession could start without delay as planned, that His Highness would be back promptly. His Highness might not have been there at the time, but there were many on site who
heard me, so how can you say I did this intentionally?
That I was being vague. Feng Xin stared at him angrily. But, if he thought about it in detail, Mu King did indeed say what he did.
Only Guoshi was too anxious and didn't want to make hasty decisions.
So if he must pick at faults, there really wasn't much to prove anything. Just then, Si Lian spoke up again. All right. It's all just an untimely misunderstanding. It's all just
bad luck, so stop fighting.
Feng Xin looked extremely displeased, but mindful of his position, he dared not be noisy in the great
martial hall, so he stopped talking.
Guoshi didn't want to pursue this topic anymore either. After all, if
they must get to the bottom of things, wasn't he at fault too for being too engrossed in card games? Thus, he simply waved and sighed.
Let's talk more later. We will discuss more on what's transpired and think of a way to save the situation. The three of you are dismissed. Go remove your costumes and do whatever else you must. Si Lian curtsied and rose to his feet.
Feng Xin and Mu King both properly kowtowed once before rising,
following behind Si Lian, who was about to leave. Si Lian had 1 foot over the threshold when he
heard Guoshi speak up. Your Highness.
Si Lian turned his head. Both His Majesty the King and Her Ladyship the Queen asked after you today. If you have time the next few days, go and see them, Guoshi said. Si Lian smiled. I understand.
After leaving the great martial hall, the three of them traversed through a large part of the summit, and
returned to the Xianlei Palace Training Hall, built especially for the Crown Prince. Si Lian could finally remove his ceremonial garb. As aforementioned, for the Shangyuan Heavenly Ceremonial Procession, As aforementioned, for the Shangyuan heavenly ceremonial procession, the ceremonial attire of the God-pleasing martial warrior was exceedingly strict in every detail. Every accessory and fold had meaning, and could not ever be misarranged or mixed up.
For example, the outer robe was to be white, symbolizing
divine purity. The inner garb was to be red, symbolizing canonical tradition. The golden crown that
fastened the hair symbolized royal power and wealth. White plumes hidden by the heart meant flight. To ascension, loose cordon ribbons along the sleeves meant to carry all lives, etc., etc.
It would be easy to imagine that, from head to toe, both to wear or to remove was no simple task. However, as the esteemed crown prince, naturally he needn't do anything himself, he only needed to
stand and open his arms wide in that refreshing, fragrant chamber, and chat with Feng Xin while waiting on his personal attendant Mu King to help remove layer after layer of this God-pleasing costume.
That outer white robe of the God-pleasing costume was of high quality, the threads delicate and exquisite. The fringes sewn with intricate light golden patterns, elegant but not frivolous. In comparison, the black martial gi of the ghost costume was a difference of heaven and earth. Mu King himself hadn't removed his black gear yet, his hands full with the God-pleasing costume he disrobed from Si Lian, and his fingers twitched, inconspicuously feeling up the material of that white robe.
Next to him, Si Lian removed the golden crown, letting his long hair loose, and sat down on the edge of
his sandalwood bed, kicking off his snow-white boots, waiting for someone to bring him fresh clothes. He waited for a bit but noticed Mu King wasn't moving, so he inclined his head.
He asked, "What's wrong?"
Mu King instantly came around and replied, "The costume seems to be dirty in some places." Si Lian Eden said, "Bring it over and let me see."
Sure enough, on the snow-white attire, were two distinct little black handprints.
Si Lian took a look and remarked, "It's probably from that little kid who fell from the sky. I remember he was grabbing on to me and wouldn't let go."
That child's face was wrapped all over with bandages. Maybe he had tumbled
elsewhere or something. Feng Xin, did you check him out? Feng Xin was just wrapping up the sword and long saber, and replied grimly, "No. I took him out of the palace, and was about to take a look at his face as you asked, but he kicked me in the shin. It actually
fucking hurt."
Si Lian fell over on the bed laughing, pointing at him. "It must be because you're so mean. Otherwise, how come he didn't kick me, but kicked you?" "I wasn't," Feng Xin cried.
"It was like that damned kid was possessed or something, and ran away right
quick. Or else I would have picked him up upside down and shook until he cried from fright." Mu King turned the white robe over in his hands.
"That kid must be a beggar. He's too dirty."
Just a simple grab and he could leave black prints like these. "Your Highness, the God-pleasing costume can't be dirty. Isn't that also a bad omen?" Si Lian stayed in his lying position on the bed, and casually grabbed a book from the headboard, covering half of his face. 3 rounds around the capital, I've already got a good name going down in history with the best record. If it's dirty, just wash it."
After a pause, Mu King replied quietly, "I will do my best to be careful when I wash it."
Si Lian flipped through the book and came to the page illustrating the art of the saber, and recalled the
exhilarating sparring earlier that day on the stage. He smiled.
Mu King, you fought well today on stage. Mu King's shoulders tensed. Si Lian continued, only today did I find out that you're much more skilled with the saber than you are with the sword. Mu King's expression relaxed and turned around. There was even a little smile playing on his lips.
Really?
Yeah.
Si Lian answered.
But you might have been too hasty. Swinging a saber is not like swinging a
sword. Look here.
The moment the topic shifted to martial arts, Si Lian became highly enthusiastic, even more possessed than when the guoshi played cards. He jumped off the bed without even putting on shoes, demonstrating his point on the spot using his hand as the pretend saber. Mu King wore a complicated expression, but after Si Lian demonstrated a few moves, he started to watch seriously. Feng Xin, on the other hand, swung the now properly wrapped long saber, and chased Si Lian back onto the bed, shouting, "If you're going to show off, at least put on your shoes before you do. You're the Crown Prince. Hair loose and feet bare, what a disgrace." Si Lian was just at the height of his excitement, but then got chased onto the bed like ducks to the pen, and was rather bitter.
All right.
"Geez," he said, and ran through his long hair with both his hands, ready to tie it up before
continuing his lecture to Mu King.
Suddenly, he frowned.
That's weird.
What is it?
Feng Xin asked. 3 Shisheng, older peer, older cultivation brother, like senpai.